A drunk man grabbed a royal guard's shoulder, refusing to let go even after a firm warning. But when he tightened his grip instead, the guard gave him one last chance to back off. He didn't, and what happened next had the crowd backing away in shock. Now, before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the royal guards that you won't want to miss. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered in respectful clusters, cameras poised to capture the iconic royal guards in their scarlet tunics and bearskin caps. Guard Michael Bennet stood at his post with perfect stillness, his polished boots planted firmly on stones that had witnessed centuries of history. His eyes, fixed forward with practiced discipline, registered everything without betraying a hint of reaction. At 28, Bennet was no ordinary guardsman. 7 years of military service had shaped him into the perfect embodiment of discipline and control. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him what real danger looked like, what real courage demanded. The scars on his left shoulder, hidden now beneath layers of immaculate uniform, served as a permanent reminder of the firefight outside Kandahar that had earned him both a commendation for valor and 3 months of painful rehabilitation. But today, standing guard outside Buckingham Palace, his battlefield was different. Instead of desert heat and insurgent threats, he faced camera flashes and curious stares. Yet the discipline remained the same: unwavering attention, perfect posture, complete control. 4 hours into his shift, his muscles knew the familiar burn of prolonged stillness, but his face betrayed nothing. This too was service. This too was duty. Families pointed and whispered, children waved hopefully at the statuesque figure, and couples posed for photographs at a respectful distance. An American family tried to make Bennet smile, the father telling increasingly elaborate jokes while his children giggled. A young couple from Japan bowed respectfully before taking a single carefully composed photograph. A group of Italian teenagers took dramatic selfies with Bennet, providing a stoic backdrop. The atmosphere was one of quiet admiration, until a commotion began to ripple through the eastern edge of the crowd. "Move! Get out of my way!" A slurred voice cut through the respectful murmurs of the tourists. The crowd parted reluctantly as Mark Davies stumbled forward, his rumpled business shirt half untucked and his tie hanging loosely around his neck. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements unsteady as he shoved past a young family. "What's all this, then?" he demanded of no one in particular, gesturing broadly at the palace, "standing there like a bloody statue while the rest of us suffer." The sharp smell of whiskey followed him as he lurched forward, drawing uncomfortable glances from nearby visitors. An elderly couple exchanged concerned looks, the man's military bearing and regimental tie suggesting he understood all too well what might follow. His wife clutched his arm as they watched Mark push his way to the front, directly facing Guard Bennet. "You there!" Mark pointed an unsteady finger at the guard. "I've got some things to say to you lot." His voice carried the unmistakable edge of a man whose personal frustrations had found a convenient target. Mark swayed slightly as he planted himself squarely in front of Guard Bennet, close enough that the guard could detect the sour mix of alcohol and resentment rolling off him in waves. The guard's eyes remained fixed ahead, his discipline unwavering despite the intrusion into his space. Bennet's peripheral vision caught every detail of the man before him: the trembling hands, the bloodshot eyes, the flecks of spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. 7 years of military training had taught Bennet to identify threats quickly, to assess risks automatically. He categorized Mark as intoxicated, agitated, unpredictable, a situation requiring vigilance but not yet intervention. "You think you're special, don't you?" Mark's voice rose, drawing more uncomfortable attention from the crowd. His words slurred together at the edges, the consonants softening as he struggled to maintain his balance. "Standing there in your fancy dress, while the rest of us deal with real problems," He jabbed a finger toward the guard's chest, stopping just short of making contact. Bennett remained motionless, though internally he noted the proximity of the finger, 2 inches from his chest, close enough to constitute a near threat, but not yet a physical violation requiring response. "My wife left me yesterday. Took the kids." Mark's voice cracked slightly, a flash of genuine pain breaking through the alcohol-fueled aggression. "And what did the judge say? That I'm unstable?" He laughed bitterly, the sound harsh against the dignified backdrop of the palace, a discordant note in the otherwise reverent atmosphere. The laugh dissolved into a hiccuping sob that he quickly suppressed, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for a fight. 3 years of marriage, gone just like that. He snapped his fingers near Bennett's face, the sharp sound causing a nearby child to flinch. A young mother hurriedly guided her children away, whispering softly, "Come along now, let's look at the palace from over there." Others began to create a subtle distance, forming an unwitting stage for Mark's performance. "Do you even hear me?" Mark demanded, circling the guard now. "Or are you deaf as well as dumb?" His shoes scuffed against the pavement as he struggled to maintain his balance. "What are you guarding anyway? Some rich family that doesn't care about people like me?" A middle-aged American tourist stepped forward tentatively. "Sir, maybe we should let the guard do his job." "His job?" Mark spun around, nearly losing his balance. "Standing still is a job now, is it? I lost my job last month. 20 years I gave that company, and they tossed me aside like garbage." He turned back to the guard. "But you get paid to stand around looking pretty." The elderly gentleman with the regimental tie moved closer, his wife still clutching his arm. His eyes reflected a calculation, not fear, but the measured assessment of a man who had faced real conflict. "Young man," he said quietly, "these guards deserve your respect." Mark snorted derisively. "Respect? For what? For playing dress-up?" He gestured wildly at the guard's immaculate uniform. "I've got 3 kids I can't see, a mortgage I can't pay, and you're telling me to respect this puppet?" The elderly man straightened to his full height. "That puppet, as you call him, has likely served in Afghanistan or Iraq. The Queen's Guard aren't just ceremonial, they're combat veterans." "Then he should say something," Mark shouted, spittle flying from his lips as he turned back to guard Bennett. "Are you even alive in there, or are you just another cog in their machine?" Mark's frustration visibly mounted as guard Bennett maintained his stoic stance, the guard's discipline in stark contrast to Mark's crumbling composure. The afternoon light caught on the polished brass buttons of the guard's tunic, reflecting golden pinpoints that seemed to mock Mark's dishevelled state. "You know what your problem is?" Mark stepped closer, his words increasingly slurred. "You're part of the system that crushes regular people, the system that took my kids, my home, my dignity." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a half-empty flask, taking a defiant swig before continuing, "Standing there all high and mighty while people like me suffer." A small group of Japanese tourists backed away, bowing slightly in apology, though they'd done nothing wrong. An American family hurried their teenage daughters to a safer distance, the father positioning himself protectively between his family and the unfolding scene. 20 years I worked," Mark's voice rose to a shout now. 20 years of loyalty, and what did I get? A cardboard box for my belongings and a "sorry budget cuts" speech from some kid half my age. He moved in an unsteady circle around the guard, forcing Bennett to track him in peripheral vision while maintaining his forward gaze. The elderly veteran stepped forward again. "That's enough, son. This man is a soldier doing his duty." "Duty?" Mark laughed, the sound hollow and pained. "What about the duty to the working people? Where was the Queen when my company shipped our jobs overseas? Where was this guard when the bailiffs came to my door?" His pain was palpable now, raw emotion breaking through the alcohol. A palace tour guide had noticed the disturbance and was speaking quietly into a radio, her eyes never leaving the escalating scene. Two other tourists, both with the bearing of off-duty police officers, had positioned themselves at the edge of the crowd, ready to intervene if necessary. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Mark suddenly shouted, his face inches from the guards. Bennett's eyes remained fixed forward, but those who looked closely might have noticed the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight whitening of his knuckles on his rifle. "Are you even listening, or are you just another puppet who can't think for himself?" The elderly veteran's wife whispered urgently, "George, please be careful," as her husband moved closer still. "The young man is drunk," George replied quietly, "but that guard is a Coldstream guard. He's seen worse than this in Helmand Province." Mark overheard this and whirled toward them. "Oh, a real soldier, is he? Then why doesn't he act like one instead of standing there like a bloody mannequin?" He turned back to Bennett, his movements becoming more erratic. "You're a joke, you know that. A tourist attraction, nothing more." The atmosphere had transformed completely from the peaceful tourist scene of just minutes before. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Several tourists had backed away completely, watching from what they deemed a safe distance. Others remained transfixed, sensing that some boundary was about to be crossed. Mark's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he studied Guard Bennett's impassive face, searching for any crack in the disciplined facade. The guard's perfect stillness seemed to enrage him further, like a personal affront to his own crumbling life. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Mark snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "standing there all perfect while my life falls apart." He circled the guard again, his movements becoming more predatory. "I lost everything. Everything." The sudden shout made several tourists jump. "And you can't even be bothered to acknowledge me?" The elderly veteran, George, had positioned himself just a few feet away, his military training evident in his stance, ready to intervene, but not escalating the situation. His wife clutched a small camera, her knuckles white with tension. "Sir," a young father called from the edge of the clearing that had formed around the confrontation, "please step back from the guard. There are children watching." Mark's head swiveled toward the voice, his face contorting with fresh anger. "Oh, I'm the problem? Not the system that throws people away?" He stabbed a finger in the guard's direction. "Not these puppets who stand by while people suffer." Guard Bennett remained motionless, but those with military experience might have noticed the subtle shift in his breathing, controlled, measured, preparing. His eyes, still fixed forward, had taken on a heightened awareness, tracking Mark through peripheral vision with the calculated precision of a trained combatant. "You know what?" Mark's voice took on a dangerous edge as he turned back to the guard. "I'm tired of being invisible." He moved directly in front of Bennett, close enough that their faces were merely inches apart. "I'm tired of the world pretending people like me don't exist." The crowd had gone utterly silent now. The only sounds, the distant London traffic and Mark's increasingly laboured breathing. A child whimpered somewhere in the background, quickly hushed by a concerned parent. "Say something," Mark demanded, spittle flying from his lips. "Acknowledge me, just once. Let's see the real person behind the costume." When the guard remained immobile, something seemed to snap in Mark. He stumbled slightly, caught himself, and then did the unthinkable. His hand shot out and grabbed the guard's shoulder, fingers digging into the scarlet fabric of the uniform. "I'm talking to you," he shouted, his grip tightening on the guard's shoulder. The change in Guard Bennett was immediate, yet controlled. His eyes, previously fixed forward, shifted to lock directly onto Mark's face. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to what tourists expected of the famously stoic guards, that an audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Those eyes, steel blue and unnervingly calm, contained none of the anger or fear that Mark might have expected. Instead, they held the steady assessment of a man who had faced true danger and knew precisely how to respond. In the split second before he spoke, Bennett made a series of rapid calculations, drawing on years of training. This wasn't Helmand Province with insurgents approaching his position. This wasn't a combat situation requiring lethal force. This was a civilian, drunk and belligerent, who had crossed a line but posed no lethal threat. Bennett's response would be calibrated accordingly, firm enough to establish control, measured enough to prevent unnecessary escalation. "Remove your hand, sir!" Bennett's voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations. Each word was delivered with perfect clarity, the kind of voice that could cut through the chaos of a battlefield, or the tension of a palace courtyard with equal effectiveness. It was the voice of command, of absolute certainty, of a man who knew exactly what would happen if his order wasn't followed. Mark, startled by the sudden response, faltered momentarily but didn't release his grip. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face, quickly replaced by stubborn defiance as the alcohol in his system overrode his instinct for self-preservation. Instead of backing away, his fingers dug deeper into the guard's uniform, wrinkling the immaculate fabric that Bennett had spent hours pressing to perfection that morning. "So, you can talk after all," he slurred, a twisted smile forming on his face as he attempted to reclaim his temporarily lost advantage. Something in Bennett's eyes, something that hinted at experiences far beyond the palace walls, caused Mark's smile to falter slightly, though his grip remained firm. "What are you going to do about it, soldier boy?" The question was posed as a challenge, but a slight tremor in his voice betrayed his growing unease. Guard Bennett's eyes hadn't left Mark's face. "I am asking you once more to remove your hand from my person." Each word was measured, precise, the warning in them clear to everyone, except, perhaps, the intoxicated man who had crossed the line. "Or what?" Mark challenged, swaying slightly but maintaining his grip. "You'll stand there some more. Call for help?" His laugh was ugly, fueled by alcohol and desperation. The elderly veteran had edged closer, ready to assist if needed. "Son, you're assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. That's a serious offence." "Armed forces?" Mark sneered, his eyes never leaving the guard's face. "He's nothing but a tourist attraction. A joke." The guard's voice, when it came again, had dropped even lower, carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Final warning, sir. Remove your hand now." Mark leaned in closer, his alcohol-laden breath washing over the guard's face. "Make me." The atmosphere in the courtyard crystallized into a moment of pure tension. Children were pulled further back by protective parents. Phones were raised higher to capture what was about to unfold. The elderly veteran's wife whispered a quiet, "Oh dear," as her husband straightened his spine, recognizing what would come next. What happened next occurred so swiftly that many tourists only captured a blur on their cameras. Guard Bennett moved with the controlled precision of a man whose training had been forged in combat zones, not palace courtyards. In one fluid motion, his hands came up, breaking Mark's grip on his shoulder before the drunk man could even register the movement. With mechanical efficiency, Bennett executed a perfect arm hold, spinning Mark around and securing his arms behind his back in a restraint position that any police officer would have recognized as textbook. The movement was neither vengeful nor excessively forceful, just the precise application of trained muscle memory designed to neutralize a threat while minimizing harm. "What the—" Mark's protest was cut short as he found himself suddenly immobilized, his face a mask of shock as his brain struggled to process how quickly the tables had turned. "You are being detained for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard," Bennett stated, his voice remaining even despite the physical exertion. "Palace security has been notified and is en route to our position." The crowd had backed away further, forming a wider circle around the scene. Parents covered their children's eyes, though there was nothing violent to see, just the perfect execution of military training against civilian belligerents. "You can't do this." Mark struggled ineffectually against the hold. "I know my rights." "Indeed, sir, you have many rights," came a new voice, calm and authoritative. A man in the uniform of a guard sergeant approached from the palace entrance. "And one of those rights is to face the consequences of assaulting a soldier on duty." Guard Sergeant James Wilson moved with the economy of motion that marked career military men. At 34, his bearing reflected 12 years of service, including combat deployments that had left him with a scar just visible beneath his left ear and a silver gallantry medal that he wore with appropriate humility. "I didn't assault anyone," Mark protested, still struggling against Bennett's immovable hold. "I just touched his shoulder. This is police brutality." "First," Sergeant Wilson replied, positioning himself where Mark could see him without Bennett having to adjust the restraint. "Guard Bennett is not police. He is a soldier of the Coldstream Guards, 2nd Battalion. He has served 3 tours in Afghanistan and has seen action that would likely cure your misplaced sense of victimhood." The veteran had moved closer, standing beside his wife with an approving nod toward the sergeant. Wilson acknowledged him with a subtle nod before continuing. "Second, what you call just touching constitutes assault against a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while on duty, a serious offence under military covenant laws." The sergeant's voice remained measured, neither rising in anger nor descending to Mark's level of emotion. "And third, if this were police brutality, sir, you would be on the ground. Guard Bennett has applied exactly the minimum force required to neutralise your aggressive action." Mark's struggles had begun to weaken as the reality of his situation, and perhaps the consequences of his actions, began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged mind. "I just wanted him to acknowledge me," he muttered, his earlier fury deflating into something closer to dejection. "These men," Wilson gestured to Bennett and the other guards visible at their posts, "aren't ceremonial props, sir. They are combat soldiers who rotate between active deployment and ceremonial duty. The discipline you witnessed, the discipline you mistook for weakness, is the same discipline that keeps them alive on the battlefield." The veteran stepped forward, addressing Sergeant Wilson with the familiar respect of one military man to another. "Coldstream Guards, sir. I served with your regiment in Bosnia, 1995. Wilson's posture shifted subtly, not relaxing, but acknowledging. "2nd Battalion, sir." "First," the veteran replied, "under Colonel Hargreaves." A flash of recognition crossed Wilson's face. "A fine officer. The regiment remembers him well." He turned his attention back to Mark, who had now gone completely still in Bennett's hold. "The gentleman you decided to harass today could share stories of Taliban firefights that would curl your hair. The discipline you mocked is what keeps him and his comrades alive." 2 palace security officers approached at a brisk pace, their radios crackling with coded communications. One nodded to Sergeant Wilson, who stepped aside to allow them access to the detained man. "This gentleman," Wilson informed them, "physically assaulted Guard Bennett while on duty. Multiple witnesses, including a regiment veteran." He gestured to George, who nodded firmly. "Understood, Sergeant," the lead security officer replied. "We'll take him from here." Bennett maintained his perfect hold until the security officers had positioned themselves on either side of Mark. Only then did he release the restraint with the same controlled precision with which he had applied it, stepping back and returning to the at-ease position in one smooth motion. "Am I being arrested?" Mark asked, his voice now small and uncertain as the security officers took his arms. "You're being detained until Metropolitan Police arrive," the officer explained. "Assaulting a guard on duty is a criminal offence." As they began to lead Mark away, Sergeant Wilson spoke once more. "Sir, I hope when you're sober, you'll reflect on what happened here today. These men stand guard, not just over buildings and people, but over principles, discipline, duty, sacrifice. Principles that remain important even when, especially when, life becomes difficult." The crowd parted to let the security team through, many tourists watching with expressions that had transformed from alarm to something closer to respect. Parents who had shielded their children's eyes now pointed discreetly toward the guards, quietly explaining the incident as a teaching moment. Bennett had already resumed his post, his posture returning to the perfect stillness that tourists expected. Only the slightly disturbed fabric of his uniform shoulder gave any indication that the incident had occurred at all. As Mark was escorted away, the atmosphere in the palace courtyard gradually shifted. The tension that had gripped the crowd began to dissolve, replaced by murmured conversations and thoughtful glances toward Guard Bennett, who had resumed his post with the same unwavering discipline that had characterized his stance before the confrontation. "Is he going to prison?" a young boy asked his father, pointing toward the retreating security detail. "He's in trouble, but what happens next will depend on many things," the father replied, clearly trying to balance honesty with age-appropriate explanation. "The important thing is that actions have consequences, especially when we don't respect others." Sergeant Wilson remained in the courtyard, speaking briefly with the elderly veteran and his wife. Their conversation was quiet, punctuated by the occasional nod toward Bennett's position and respectful acknowledgement of shared military understanding. "Will Guard Bennett face any disciplinary action?" a concerned American tourist asked the sergeant as he prepared to return to his duties. Wilson's response was measured but clear. Guard Bennett acted entirely within protocol for responding to a physical threat while on duty. The Queen's Guard are not simply ceremonial figures. They are active duty soldiers with the authority and training to respond to security threats. His tone carried both pride and a touch of weariness, suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd needed to explain this reality to visitors. The following morning dawned clear over London, the incident at Buckingham Palace already filtering into the collective awareness of those who had witnessed it and those who had only heard accounts. Guard Bennett reported for duty as usual, his uniform impeccable, his bearing unchanged by the previous day's events. For him, the incident had been simply another moment requiring professional response, neither more nor less significant than the thousands of hours of ceremonial duty he had performed with equal dedication. For Mark Davies, however, the morning brought a starkly different reality. Released from custody with a court summons and a prohibition from approaching palace grounds, he sat on a park bench in Green Park, staring at the legal documents in his trembling hands. The charges were serious: assault of military personnel on duty, public intoxication, disorderly conduct. But more sobering than the legal consequences was the clarity that had come with sobriety, the painful recognition of how completely he had lost control. "I became everything I used to despise," he would later tell his court-appointed therapist. "Entitled, aggressive, blaming others for my problems." The path to this realization had been costly, but as he watched palace guards changing shifts in the distance, something shifted in his understanding as well. Tourists continued to visit Buckingham Palace, many unaware of the previous day's drama. Some noticed the slightly increased security presence, the subtle adjustments to visitor barriers that created clearer boundaries around the guards' positions. Tour guides had incorporated additional information into their presentations, emphasizing the guards' status as active military personnel and clarifying the protocols for respectful observation. "The discipline you observe in these guards isn't theatrical," one guide explained to her group. "It's the same discipline that serves them in combat zones. They stand here not as attractions, but as embodiments of duty and service." As twilight settled over London once more, the palace guards continued their precise routines, untouched by the public's evolving perception of their role. For them, duty remained duty, whether standing motionless for the admiration of tourists or responding to threats with trained precision. The ceremonial and the functional aspects of their service were not separate duties, but integrated facets of the same commitment to something larger than themselves. What would you have done if you witnessed this confrontation at Buckingham Palace? Would you have intervened, stepped back, or perhaps tried to de-escalate the situation before it reached its breaking point? And if this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and consider sharing it with others who might appreciate this glimpse into the reality behind the ceremony. Every subscription to our channel helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to light. Want to see more stories about encounters with royal guards? Check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. And we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video.